The morning air hung thick over Tokyo Bay. September 2nd, 1945. Silence fell across the deck of the USS Missouri. Not the silence of peace, but the silence of men witnessing the impossible made real. Japanese officials stepped forward to sign the surrender documents. Their hands trembled. Not from fear. These were men who had commanded armies, sent thousands to their deaths without hesitation. No, they trembled because surrounding them, stretching to every horizon, was proof that they had been warned. 300 warships filled the bay. Aircraft carriers lined the water like steel mountains. Destroyers, cruisers, battleships, a ring of American power so absolute it seemed to bend reality itself. Above, 900 aircraft darkened the sky in formation after formation, engines thundering a message that needed no translation. One man had predicted this exact moment. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. He'd been dead for over 2 years by then, shot from the sky over the Solomon Islands. But standing on that deck, watching MacArthur accept their surrender, these Japanese commanders finally understood what Yamamoto had been trying to tell them since 1940. They were staring at American firepower. The very thing he said would destroy them. And the most haunting truth of all, he had seen it coming. They all had. This isn't a story about how Japan lost the war. It's about how Japan's own leaders knew they would lose, were told exactly how they would lose, and attacked anyway. Yamamoto knew America in ways most Japanese officers refused to understand. From 1919 to 1921, he lived in Cambridge, Massachusetts, studying at Harvard University. 35 years old, already missing 2 fingers from his left hand, blown off during the Battle of Tsushima against the Russian fleet. He carried the scars of combat on his body, but nothing in his experience as a warrior prepared him for what he found in America. He rented a small room in Boston, walked tree-lined streets in New England, watched ordinary people live their daily lives. He learned to play poker and bridge, games he'd love until the day he died. Those card games taught him something crucial about American psychology. Americans calculated odds. They took aggressive risks. They studied their opponents and exploited every weakness. And they absolutely refused to accept defeat gracefully. These were not the characteristics of a soft, decadent people. These were the characteristics of a nation that would fight to total victory or total destruction. He studied economics, focusing obsessively on the oil industry. Oil, the blood of modern warfare. Ships burned it. Aircraft burned it. Tanks burned it. A navy without fuel was just decorative steel floating in harbors. And America had more oil than Yamamoto's mind could fully grasp. But 3 things he witnessed shocked him more than anything else. First, women attended Harvard as equals, sitting in the same classrooms, studying the same subjects. In Japan, this was unthinkable. To Yamamoto, it meant America was willing to mobilize its entire population for national purposes. Half their population wasn't sitting idle at home. They were learning, working, building. Second, sugar. Just sugar. In Japan, it was rationed, precious, controlled. In America, people ate it without thinking. Luxuries were everyday necessities. The abundance seemed almost obscene to a man from resource-starved Japan. Third, and this was what truly terrified him, the factories, the steel mills, the oil fields, production capacity that made everything in Asia look like a child's workshop. Yamamoto traveled to Detroit, stood inside Ford and General Motors factories, watched assembly lines produce automobiles at speeds that seemed physically impossible. A single Ford plant built more cars in 1 month than all of Japan's automobile industry produced in an entire year. The efficiency was unlike anything he'd seen in Asia or Europe. Men and machines moving in perfect coordination, creating finished vehicles at a pace that bordered on supernatural. He went to Texas, stood among the oil derricks stretching across the landscape in every direction. American wells pumped more petroleum in 30 days than Japan possessed in its entire strategic reserve. Tank farms held millions of barrels. Refineries processed fuel around the clock, flames burning into the night sky like industrial volcanoes. Japan, by contrast, had almost no domestic oil. Every drop of fuel had to be imported from the Dutch East Indies, thousands of miles away across sea lanes that could be cut at any moment. He visited Pennsylvania, watched rivers of molten steel pour from blast furnaces that operated 24 hours a day. Pittsburgh alone manufactured more steel than the entire Japanese Empire. And steel was everything. Without steel, there could be no ships, no tanks, no artillery, no aircraft. Without steel, there was no modern war. What he saw changed him. He returned to Japan understanding something fundamental. If war came, Japan would be fighting a nation that could produce, supply, and sustain military operations at a scale that defied comprehension. He rose through the ranks, became an advocate for naval aviation when most admirals still worshipped battleships, helped build Japan's carrier fleet into the most powerful striking force in the Pacific, served again in Washington from 1926 to 28, deepening his understanding of American society. He became fluent in English, played poker with American officers and businessmen, learned to read their tells, understand their competitive nature. He developed a respect for American culture that made him simultaneously admire and fear the United States. And throughout his career, he warned anyone who would listen about the danger of underestimating American industrial power. 1940. The militarists in Tokyo were pushing for war. Yamamoto was asked directly, what would happen if Japan attacked the United States? His answer became legendary. If ordered to fight, he said, he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. He would win victory after victory. Japanese forces would dominate the Pacific. But after that, he had no expectation of success. None. He'd seen the factories. He'd witnessed the material wealth. He understood that Japan lacked the national power for a prolonged war with America. He said it plainly to anyone who would listen, and his words have been verified through multiple historical sources. Anyone who has seen the auto factories in Detroit and the oil fields in Texas knows that Japan lacks the national power for a naval race with America. He wasn't predicting defeat to demoralize his nation. He was trying to prevent catastrophic mistake. But Yamamoto went further. He explained exactly what victory would require. His words were chilling in their honesty. Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it is not enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. We would have to march into Washington and sign the treaty in the White House. Think about what he was saying. Total conquest of the American mainland. Occupation of the United States. Dictating terms in their capital. It was obviously impossible. That was his entire point. Japanese propagandists later twisted his words, presenting them as confident predictions of victory. American propagandists did the same, using them to portray Yamamoto as a dangerous fanatic. But his meaning was the exact opposite. He was counseling against war by demonstrating its impossibility. They didn't listen. December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto had designed the attack himself. If war was inevitable, give Japan its best chance. Knock out the American Pacific Fleet. Buy time to establish a defensive perimeter. Win a short war since a long war was unwinnable. 350 Japanese aircraft descended on Hawaii in 2 waves. Complete tactical surprise. American sailors at breakfast. Soldiers sleeping in barracks. Sunday morning peace shattered by diving aircraft and exploding bombs. 18 American ships sunk or damaged. 8 battleships destroyed or crippled. The USS Arizona exploded catastrophically. 1,100 sailors killed in seconds. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds below decks. 188 American aircraft destroyed on the ground. Over 2,400 Americans dead. 1,100 wounded. Japanese pilots returned celebrating what looked like stunning victory. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo received congratulations from his officers. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who'd led the first wave, and sent the famous Tora message confirming surprise. Circled above the harbor observing the destruction, Nagumo decided to withdraw. Mission accomplished. His aircraft had suffered losses. American defenses were alert now. The prudent choice was to return home. But Yamamoto wasn't celebrating. When news reached him aboard his flagship Nagato, he was subdued. Quiet. He recognized what others couldn't see. The American carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga, had all escaped. The attack had sunk old battleships, but missed the ships that would actually decide the war. And most importantly, the attack had united a divided American nation in absolute fury. Yamamoto understood American psychology better than anyone in Japan. He knew a sneak attack would enrage Americans in ways Tokyo's militarists couldn't comprehend. Before December 7th, Americans had been deeply divided about entering the war. Isolationists argued for staying out. Interventionists argued for joining. The nation was torn. After December 7th, unified. Completely. The kind of unity Japan's leaders had thought impossible. The 6 months began. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia with speed that shocked the world. Wake Island fell December 23rd. Hong Kong surrendered Christmas Day. Manila declared an open city December 26th. Singapore, supposedly the strongest fortress in the British Empire, collapsed February 15th with over 80,000 British and Commonwealth troops captured. The Dutch East Indies fell in March. Burma by May. Japanese soldiers stood triumphant from the Aleutians to the Solomons, from Burma to the Marshalls. The largest, fastest military expansion in human history. The rising sun flag flew over territories containing 400 million people. The resources Japan had gone to war for, particularly oil, were finally in Japanese hands. Newspapers celebrated. Military leaders basked in glory. Divine destiny seemed assured. But Yamamoto counted days. He knew his 6 months were ticking away. And somewhere across the Pacific, American factories were already beginning to turn. June 4th, 1942. Exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. The Battle of Midway. Yamamoto had planned this as the decisive engagement. 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, 2 light carriers, 11 battleships, over 250 aircraft, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled. The plan was complex, perhaps too complex. Forces divided among multiple groups spread across hundreds of miles. Yamamoto commanded from the battleship Yamato, the largest warship in the world, but positioned himself far behind the carrier strike force. Communications between scattered forces proved difficult. The Americans had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Japanese intelligence believed Yorktown would be out of action for months after severe damage at the Coral Sea. Her flight deck had been holed by bombs. Internal structure damaged. Normal repairs would take 90 days. American repair crews at Pearl Harbor worked around the clock. 3 shifts. 72 hours later, Yorktown sailed back to war. Impossible feat of engineering. It would prove decisive. American codebreakers had intercepted Japanese communications. Station Hypo in Hawaii, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, had broken enough of the Japanese naval code to know the attack was coming and where. Admiral Chester Nimitz positioned his carriers northeast of Midway and waited. The battle began at dawn. Japanese aircraft launched to strike Midway Island. Vice Admiral Nagumo sent over 100 aircraft to neutralize the island's defenses. The strike succeeded in destroying many American aircraft, but the island's anti-aircraft guns remained operational. Surviving American planes attacked the Japanese fleet. These initial attacks were disasters. Torpedo bombers from Midway, slow, vulnerable, without fighter escort, were slaughtered by Japanese Zeros. Of 41 American torpedo planes that attacked that morning, only 6 survived. Not a single torpedo hit its target. But while Japanese fighters were down at low altitude chasing torpedo bombers, American dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. Flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed. Aviation gasoline pumped from hoses strewn everywhere. Bombs and torpedoes stacked near aircraft waiting to be loaded. The carriers were floating ammunition dumps. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey led dive bombers from Enterprise. They'd been searching for the Japanese fleet and were running low on fuel. McCluskey spotted a Japanese destroyer heading northeast and followed it. The destroyer was returning to the main fleet after attacking an American submarine. McCluskey's gamble paid off. 5 minutes. 3 Japanese carriers reduced to burning wrecks. Akagi, the flagship, took 1 bomb that ignited gasoline and armed aircraft. Kaga took 4 bombs that turned her hangar deck into an inferno. Soryu took 3 bombs that set off chain reactions of explosions. All 3 carriers abandoned within hours. A 4th carrier, Hiryu, had been separated and escaped initially. Her aircraft counterattacked, finding Yorktown and hitting her with bombs and torpedoes. The American carrier was fatally damaged, eventually sinking after being hit by a Japanese submarine 2 days later. But Hiryu was caught that afternoon. American dive bombers found her and scored 4 direct hits. She burned through the night, scuttled the next morning. In a single day, Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, a heavy cruiser, 248 aircraft, and over 3,000 sailors and airmen, including many of its most experienced pilots. American losses? 1 carrier, 1 destroyer, 150 aircraft, 307 men. Japan had suffered its first decisive carrier defeat, its most catastrophic naval loss since the rise of the Imperial Navy. More importantly, the expansion was over. From this point forward, Japan would fight a defensive war it could not win. Yamamoto received the news aboard his flagship. Officers who witnessed his reaction said he was not surprised. He'd predicted 6 months of victory. Midway came exactly 6 months after Pearl Harbor. His prophecy fulfilled to the day. The next phase revealed exactly what Yamamoto had warned about. While Japan struggled to replace lost carriers and pilots, American industry hit its stride. Before the war, Japan had 6 large fleet carriers. After Midway, 2 Japanese shipyards began construction on replacements, but their industrial base was fundamentally limited. Raw materials scarce and becoming scarcer as American submarines sank merchant ships. Skilled workers few because Japan lacked the large pool of trained industrial labor America possessed. Each new carrier took years to complete. The United States had 7 fleet carriers when war began. By 1943, American shipyards launched a new carrier every month. By 1944, the Pacific Fleet had more than 20 fleet and light carriers with dozens more under construction. American industrial production wasn't just growing, it was accelerating. Essex-class carriers exemplified American power. Over 27,000 tons fully loaded, carried approximately 90 aircraft each. Most powerful warships ever built, superior in every way to Japanese carriers. Faster, better armored, carried more aircraft, incorporated design lessons learned from early battles. Before the war, such ships would take 3 to 4 years to build. American shipyards, operating around the clock with 3 shifts, using innovative prefabrication techniques, reduced construction time to as little as 14 months. 24 Essex-class carriers built during the war. 14 saw combat in the Pacific. Destroyer construction was equally astonishing. At one point in 1943, American shipyards launched a new destroyer every 4 days. Navy officials joked they had to ask Congress to stop ordering destroyers because the fleet had more than it could crew. Liberty ships, cargo vessels carrying supplies across the Pacific, were built even faster. Average construction time dropped from 244 days early in the war to 42 days by 1943. One Liberty ship, the SS Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes as a demonstration of what American industry could achieve. Over 2,700 Liberty ships built during the war. Japanese pilots who had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor and the Philippines found themselves facing endless waves of new American aircraft. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the fighter that terrorized Allied airmen in 41 and 42, was designed for lightness and maneuverability. It could outclimb and outturn almost any opponent. Japanese pilots loved it. But the Zero achieved its agility by sacrificing armor and self-sealing fuel tanks. A few hits from American guns would send a Zero down in flame. American designers took a different approach. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was heavier, slower to climb, less maneuverable in turning fights, but it was faster in level flight and dives. Carried heavier armament, 650 caliber machine guns instead of the Zero's 220mm cannons and 2 light machine guns. Most importantly, it protected its pilot with armor plate and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb battle damage. American tactics emphasized these strengths. Hellcat pilots were taught never to dogfight Zeros at low speed. Instead, use superior speed and dive performance to make slashing attacks. Hit hard. Disengage before Japanese pilots could respond. The tactics were devastatingly effective. The Vought Furu Corsair was even more formidable. Fastest fighter in the Pacific, capable of over 400 miles per hour. Japanese pilots learned to fear its distinctive inverted gull-wing silhouette. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning with twin engines and twin tail booms gave American pilots extended range and devastating firepower, concentrated in the nose. It was P-38s that would eventually shoot down Admiral Yamamoto himself. But it wasn't just quality that overwhelmed Japan. It was quantity on a scale that defied comprehension. The United States produced over 300,000 military aircraft during World War II. Japan produced approximately 70,000. 5 American combat aircraft for every one Japan built. And American training programs graduated pilots at rates Japan could never match. When Japanese pilots were killed, they were replaced by hastily trained recruits with inadequate flight hours. When American pilots were killed, they were replaced by pilots who'd received hundreds of hours of training in stateside programs that operated without fear of enemy attack. The disparity extended to every category. American shipyards produced over 150 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan produced 18. American factories produced 88,000 tanks. Japan produced fewer than 5,000. American arsenals turned out 41 billion rounds of small arms ammunition. Japanese production was a fraction of that. Emperor Hirohito himself began noticing the disparity. Late December 1942, as the battle for Guadalcanal raged, Hirohito questioned his military chiefs about why American forces seemed so much better equipped. His generals and admirals explained the challenges of supply lines and logistics. But one exchange revealed the fundamental problem. Hirohito asked about reports that Americans completed airfield construction in days while Japanese engineers required over a month. His officers explained that Americans used machines to accomplish tasks Japanese forces did by hand. American construction equipment could clear jungle and level ground at speeds that seemed impossible. The emperor reportedly fell silent. He understood. Japan was fighting a war of manpower against a nation of machines. Guadalcanal became a grinding war of attrition Japan could not win. American forces landed August 7, 42, just 2 months after Midway. They captured an unfinished Japanese airfield. American engineers finished it in record time, laid pierced steel planking over the dirt runway, renamed it Henderson Field after Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Henderson Field became the pivot around which the entire battle revolved. Aircraft from Henderson could attack Japanese ships attempting to reinforce the island. Japanese commanders realized they had to destroy the airfield or abandon the Solomon Islands. For 6 months they tried everything. Navy ships clashed in waters around Guadalcanal in desperate night battles, some of the most vicious naval combat of the war. Japanese commanders excelled at night fighting. Their superior training in torpedo tactics and deadly long lance torpedoes meant American ships often came off worse in these nighttime clashes. Both sides lost numerous vessels in what became known as Iron Bottom, sound for the number of ships sinking in its waters. The naval battle of Savo Island, August 8th and 9th, was a catastrophe for the Allies. A Japanese cruiser force surprised screening ships guarding the landing beaches and sank 4 heavy cruisers in less than an hour. American ships Quincy, Vincennes, and Astoria. Australian ship Canberra. Over 1,000 Allied sailors died. Worst defeat in American naval history in a surface engagement, surpassed only by Pearl Harbor itself. But there was a crucial difference between Japanese and American losses. Every American ship that sank could be replaced. Every Japanese ship lost was gone forever. American shipyards were already building replacement cruisers faster than they could be sunk. Japanese shipyards could not keep pace. The Tokyo Express, Americans' name for nightly Japanese destroyer runs bringing reinforcements and supplies to Guadalcanal, demonstrated both Japanese determination and American growing dominance. Japanese destroyers would race down the slot, the channel between the Solomon Islands, at night, unload troops and supplies, race back before dawn when American aircraft from Henderson Field would attack. Dangerous, desperate supply line that delivered men but rarely heavy equipment or sufficient food. Japanese soldiers on Guadalcanal suffered terribly. Cut off from adequate supply, they began to starve within weeks. Daily rice ration cut repeatedly. They ate grass, roots, insects. Eventually, each other. Tropical diseases killed thousands. Malaria, dysentery, beriberi swept through units lacking medicine, clean water, proper nutrition. Officers reported their men too weak to carry rifles, let alone attack American positions defended by well-fed troops with plentiful ammunition. Japanese attacks on Henderson Field were brave but futile. Soldiers charged into American machine gun fire, threw themselves at barbed wire, died in heaps before Marine positions. The Ikiki detachment annihilated in August. Kawaguchi Brigade shattered in September during the Battle of Bloody Ridge. Each attack was supposed to be the decisive assault. Each attack failed against firepower that seemed inexhaustible. February 43rd. Japan evacuated surviving forces from Guadalcanal. Of 36,000 Japanese troops committed, over 20,000 were dead. Most from disease and starvation rather than combat. Many survivors too weak to walk had to be carried to evacuation ships. American losses: approximately 1,600 killed in action, with thousands more wounded or struck by tropical diseases. The pattern established at Guadalcanal would repeat across the Pacific for the next 2.5 years. Japan would defend an island with determination and courage. American forces would assault with overwhelming firepower and material. Japanese defenders would inflict casualties but ultimately be annihilated. Then Americans would advance to the next island, bringing more ships, more planes, more men, more equipment than before. June 1944 Total. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Japan's attempt to reverse the tide. The decisive battle Japanese strategists had dreamed of since war began. 9 carriers with over 500 aircraft. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his pilots could defeat the Americans if given a chance to strike first. His carriers would launch from beyond American attack range, strike the enemy fleet, land on airfields in the Mariana Islands to refuel and rearm, then return to carriers. Elegant plan that might have worked in 42, but this was 44. Instead of the weakened force Japan expected, they encountered Task Force 58 under Admiral Mark Mitcher. Most powerful naval force in history up to that point. 15 American carriers, including 7 new Essex-class ships, launching over 900 aircraft. American pilots superbly trained, many with combat experience. Flying aircraft that outperformed anything Japan could field. The Japanese struck first as Ozawa planned, but American radar detected incoming attacks long before they reached the fleet. Hellcats scrambled to intercept, guided by fighter directors tracking both friend and foe on radar screens. The result was massacre. The battle became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American fighters vectored onto Japanese formations, tore through attacking aircraft. Japanese pilots, many recent graduates with minimal flight training, flew rigid formations that made them easy targets. They lacked fuel to maneuver extensively, lacked experience to respond to American tactics. Over 350 Japanese aircraft shot down on June 19th alone. American fighters and anti-aircraft guns destroyed wave after wave. Only a handful of Japanese aircraft reached the American fleet. Minor damage scored. American losses that day: approximately 30 aircraft. The next day, American aircraft found the Japanese fleet and attacked at extreme range near sunset. They sank the carrier Hio and damaged several others. The return flight to American carriers in darkness was dangerous. Many pilots ran out of fuel and ditched in the ocean. But rescue operations recovered most downed aircrews. Over 50 American aircraft lost to fuel exhaustion, but only 16 pilots and 33 aircrew died. When the battle ended, Japan had lost 3 carriers, including Taiho, the newest and most advanced ship in the fleet, which exploded due to aviation fuel. Over 600 aircraft destroyed. More critically, Japan lost most remaining trained naval aviators. Men who died over the Philippine Sea could never be replaced. Japan no longer had time to train pilots properly. Fuel for training flights increasingly scarce. The Japanese carrier force was effectively finished as a fighting unit. It would sortie once more at Leyte Gulf in October 44th, but only as a decoy force meant to draw American carriers away from invasion beaches. Great carriers that struck Pearl Harbor and conquered half the Pacific were reduced to empty hulks, offering themselves as bait. American pilots who participated in the Philippine Sea battle expressed amazement at how easy it had been. Japanese pilots they faced were nothing like skilled veterans of 41 and 42. These were hastily trained replacements flying predictable formations, falling quickly to American guns. One American pilot described it as shooting fish in a barrel. Another compared it to a training exercise. Days of feared Japanese air superiority were over. July 44th. Saipan fell, part of the Mariana Islands. Its capture meant American B-29 bombers could now reach Japanese home islands. Tokyo itself within range. Strategic implications devastating. Japan's war planners had always assumed home islands would remain beyond reach of enemy bombers. That assumption shattered. Civilian population, already struggling with shortages, would face direct attack. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who'd led Japan into war, resigned in disgrace. His government fell, replaced by leaders who privately understood the war was lost but couldn't bring themselves to surrender. General Tomoyuki Yamashita, conqueror of Singapore, the Tiger of Malaya, transferred to command defense of the Philippines. He understood perfectly what he faced. Americans had returned with overwhelming force. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of soldiers. Yamashita fought a skillful defensive campaign, retreating into Luzon's mountains, avoiding the decisive battle American commanders sought. But he couldn't stop the American advance. Supply lines cut. Ammunition dwindled. Soldiers starved in the jungle while American troops received regular rations, mail from home, even ice cream. After the war, Yamashita was tried for war crimes in Manila. Proceedings revealed the impossible situation he'd faced. American attacks destroyed his communications networks. He couldn't coordinate scattered forces because he lacked radios, vehicles, even reliable messenger services. Japanese commanders throughout the Philippines isolated, unable to receive orders or report situations. American forces, by contrast, seemed to possess unlimited resources. They could bombard Japanese positions for hours before attacking, call in airstrikes at will, bring up tanks, artillery, fresh infantry whenever needed. Japanese soldiers who survived American assaults described walls of fire that seemed impossible to penetrate. The final year brought suffering to Japan on a scale even Yamamoto hadn't imagined. American B-29 bombers flying from Saipan, Tinian, and Guam began systematic attacks on Japanese cities in November 44. Initially, precision raids aimed at aircraft factories and industrial facilities. But poor weather and limitations of high-altitude bombing produced disappointing results. March 45 Dive. Strategy changed. General Curtis LeMay ordered low-altitude incendiary raids against Japanese urban areas. Night of March 9th and 10th. Over 300 B-29s attacked Tokyo with incendiary bombs. The resulting firestorm killed approximately 100,000 people, destroyed 16 square miles of city, left over 1 million homeless. Deadliest air raid in human history. Just the beginning. Following months, American bombers burned city after city. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, dozens of smaller cities reduced to ashes. Japan's industrial capacity, already strained, collapsed. Factory workers fled to the countryside. Raw materials couldn't reach assembly lines. Production of aircraft ammunition equipment fell catastrophically. By summer 45, American bombers had run out of major cities to burn. They began attacking smaller towns, warning residents with leaflets before raids. Japanese air defense system, once formidable, had been destroyed. American bombers flew with near impunity over the home islands. Japanese response was kamikaze attacks, suicide strikes by pilots who deliberately crashed aircraft into American ships. These attacks began during the Philippines campaign and intensified during battles for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Thousands of young Japanese men volunteered to die, flying obsolete aircraft on one-way missions against the American fleet. Kamikaze attacks caused significant American casualties. At Okinawa, suicide planes sank 26 American ships and damaged over 200 more. But they couldn't change the war's outcome. For every kamikaze pilot who reached his target, more were shot down by American fighters and anti-aircraft guns. And the flow of American ships seemed endless. Japanese commanders who survived the war described their astonishment at American resilience. Ships that would have crippled any other navy were repaired and returned to combat within weeks. Losses that would have forced other nations to negotiate were absorbed without hesitation. Americans kept coming, wave after wave, until there was nothing left to defend. April 45 Invasion of Okinawa demonstrated the full weight of American power. Assault force included over 1,300 ships and over 180,000 soldiers, sailors, and marines. Largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. Japanese defenders fought with customary determination. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers died defending the island. But American firepower was overwhelming. Naval gunfire support ships could deliver more explosive power in a single day than the entire Japanese Navy possessed. Carrier aircraft attacked at will, having destroyed remnants of Japanese air power. Battle lasted nearly 3 months. Cost over 12,000 American lives, with total casualties approaching 50,000, including wounded. Japanese military deaths exceeded 100,000. Civilian casualties on the island may have reached 100,000 more, including many who committed suicide rather than surrender. By summer 45, Japan was utterly defeated but had not surrendered. American military planners prepared for Operation Downfall, invasion of Japanese home islands. They estimated over 1 million American casualties and possibly 10 million Japanese deaths. Fighting would make Okinawa look minor by comparison. But another demonstration of American industrial and scientific power was coming. Since 42, the United States had been working on a secret project code named Manhattan. Thousands of scientists, engineers, workers labored at sites across the country. Los Alamos in New Mexico, Oak Ridge in Tennessee, Hanford in Washington. They were building the most destructive weapon in human history. Japan had no equivalent program. The atomic bomb project cost approximately $2 billion, equivalent of over $30 billion today. Employed over 125,000 people at its peak. Consumed more electricity than some small countries. It represented an industrial and scientific effort no other nation on Earth could have mounted during wartime. August 6, 1945, a single B-29 bomber named Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, dropped an atomic bomb called Little Boy on Hiroshima. Weapon detonated at 8:15 in the morning local time, approximately 1,900 feet above the city. Explosion killed approximately 80,000 people instantly. Fireball, hotter than the surface of the sun, vaporized everything within half a mile radius. Blast wave demolished buildings up to a mile away. Fires swept through wreckage driven by tremendous heat. Within hours, black rain containing radioactive particles fell on the devastated city. By end of 1945, death toll would reach approximately 140,000 as victims succumbed to burns, radiation sickness, injuries. Japanese leaders were stunned but didn't immediately surrender. Some believed it must have been a freak accident or perhaps natural disaster. Others suspected a new weapon but doubted America could have more than one. Supreme Council met but couldn't reach agreement on how to respond. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb destroyed Nagasaki. Fat Man, plutonium implosion device, different in design from the Hiroshima bomb, detonated over Nagasaki at 11:02 in the morning, August 9th. City's hilly terrain limited damage compared to flat Hiroshima, but approximately 40,000 people died immediately. Final toll reaching over 70,000. These weapons represented something unprecedented in human history. Ability to destroy an entire city with a single bomb carried by a single aircraft. And the fact that America possessed them while Japan didn't illustrated the ultimate disparity between two nations. American industry, American science, American resources had produced weapons Japan couldn't even imagine, let alone build. Some Japanese military leaders wanted to continue fighting even after Nagasaki. They argued Japan still had millions of soldiers under arms. Insisted Americans couldn't have many atomic bombs. Urged preparations for final suicidal defense of the homeland. Emperor Hirohito intervened personally to end the war. In an unprecedented move, he attended an imperial conference near midnight, August 9th, and declared his support for accepting Allied surrender terms. August 14th, the council accepted. August 15th, Hirohito's recorded voice was broadcast to Japanese people for the first time in history. Emperor didn't use the word surrender. Japanese officials couldn't bring themselves to speak so directly. Instead, Hirohito said the war situation had developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. He announced Japan had decided to effect a settlement of the present situation by resorting to an extraordinary measure. Meaning was clear, despite euphemisms. Japan had lost. September 2nd. Date. Aboard the USS Missouri. Formal surrender signed. General MacArthur presided. Representatives of Japan signed documents accepting complete defeat. Around the Missouri, those 300 ships and 900 aircraft displayed the power that had destroyed the Japanese Empire. Visual demonstration of everything Yamamoto had predicted and his colleagues had refused to believe. In years after the war, surviving Japanese commanders were interrogated by American officers, seeking to understand the conflict from the enemy's perspective. These interviews, conducted under the United States Strategic Bombing Survey and other intelligence programs, revealed many Japanese leaders had known from the beginning their cause was hopeless. They'd fought anyway. Some out of loyalty, some out of honor, some because they couldn't imagine any other course. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, who'd led the air attack on Pearl Harbor, who'd shouted Tora, 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 conferring surprise over Hawaii, who'd circled above Pearl Harbor watching American battleships burn, was among those interrogated. He'd survived the war despite participating in most major battles. one of the few Japanese aviators to do so. Fukuda told American interrogators Japan never had a realistic chance of winning. Attack on Pearl Harbor, he argued, had been a strategic mistake. It awakened American fury without crippling American power. Carriers that escaped would have been far more valuable targets than old battleships that were sunk. When asked about American firepower, Fukuda described the shock Japanese pilots felt as the war progressed. In 1941, Japanese aircraft and pilots were superior to anything Americans could field. Japanese training rigorous, producing superb aviators. Japanese aircraft designed for specific demands of Pacific warfare. Zero Fighter was the finest carrier aircraft in the world. But by 1943, the equation changed. American aircraft better designed, more heavily armed, more rugged in combat. By 1944, American pilots far more numerous and increasingly experienced. Japanese pilots who dominated early battles were dead, killed over Midway and the Solomons and a dozen other battlefields. Replacements were novices who couldn't match American training because Japan lacked fuel and time to train them properly. Fukuda recalled missions in later war years where Japanese formations were intercepted by swarms of American fighters before they could even reach targets. Pilots who'd survived dozens of missions in 1942 were shot down on their first mission in 1944. Americans seemed to know where Japanese were going and what they intended to do. Fukuda didn't know about American code breaking, but he understood Japanese pilots had lost technological and tactical superiority they once possessed. Other Japanese officers spoke of their despair as American production overwhelmed defenses. One naval officer described watching American ships appear on the horizon, knowing each one carried more ammunition than his entire command would receive in a month. He watched American destroyers expend more shells in a single bombardment than Japanese ships received in a year of resupply. Disparity wasn't just material, it was psychological. Japanese defenders knew they were fighting an enemy that could afford to waste resources they couldn't replace. An army general spoke of ordering attacks against American positions, possessing more artillery than Japan had in its entire army. He watched American firepower reduce defensive positions to rubble before infantry even advanced. He ordered counterattacks annihilated by naval gunfire called in from ships offshore. He understood courage and determination meant nothing against enemies who could simply bury you in steel and explosives. Fundamental truth that emerged from these interrogations was simple and stark. Japan had attacked a nation with 10 times its industrial capacity, 3 times its population, vastly greater natural resources. Japanese planners hoped for a short war ending in negotiated peace. They assumed Americans, who'd shown reluctance to enter the European war, would be unwilling to pay the cost of retaking distant Pacific islands. They believed after some initial defeats, America would negotiate rather than fight a long, costly campaign across the Pacific. They got a long war ending in total destruction. Yamamoto never saw the final defeat. April 18th, 1943. American codebreakers intercepted his travel itinerary. Flight of P-38 Lightning fighters dispatched to intercept his aircraft over Bougainville in the Solomon Islands. Mission succeeded. Yamamoto's plane shot down. Admiral who planned Pearl Harbor killed. His death came less than a year and a half after the attack that was supposed to win the war. In that brief time, all his predictions had been confirmed. 6 months of victory followed by grinding defeat. American industrial power crushed Japanese expansion. Sleeping giant awakened. The tragedy of the Pacific War wasn't that Japan underestimated America. Tragedy was that Japan's most respected naval strategist told his government exactly what would happen, and they attacked anyway. Yamamoto warned about Detroit's factories and Texas oil fields. Colleagues dismissed his concerns as excessive caution. Yamamoto predicted 6 months of victory followed by defeat. Colleagues assumed American decadence would prevent sustained resistance. Yamamoto said Japan would have to march to Washington to win. Colleagues believed capturing a few islands would force negotiation. They were wrong about everything. Millions of people, Japanese, American, others across Asia and the Pacific, paid the price for their willful blindness. In his final years, Yamamoto grew increasingly fatalistic about the war he'd been ordered to fight. He told subordinates he was living on borrowed time, expected to die before conflict ended, knew everything he'd predicted was coming true and nothing could stop it. There's a lesson in Yamamoto's story extending beyond World War II. Expertise and accurate prediction mean nothing if leaders refuse to listen. Yamamoto possessed better knowledge of American capabilities than any other senior Japanese officer. He provided precise, accurate warnings about what would happen if Japan attacked the United States. His warnings were ignored because they were politically inconvenient. Militarists who drove Japan to war believed what they wanted to believe, convinced themselves American luxury made Americans soft, assured themselves Japan's warrior spirit would overcome material disadvantages, trusted in divine destiny and dismissed material factors as secondary. Wreckage of their empire spread across the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo Bay proved them wrong. As those Japanese officials stood on the Missouri that September morning, they could see truth surrounding them in steel and fire. Over 300 ships, nearly 900 aircraft, industrial might Yamamoto had witnessed in Detroit and Texas, transformed into military power that crushed everything Japan threw against it. Admiral Yamamoto had given them the answer years before anyone asked the question. He'd stood in American factories and seen the future. He'd warned his nation and been ignored. And in the end, his prediction proved perfect. Japan had run wild for 6 months. Then the awakened giant responded with firepower beyond anything the world had ever seen. Long after the smoke cleared, the silence still spoke of what they built and what it cost.